A DNA analysis has allowed police to confirm the killer of a Florida woman who was brutally murdered in her home nearly 37 years ago. Police have identified the killer by linking the killer's DNA to a child from an illicit affair in the family. Teresa Lee Scalf, a 29-year-old nurse, was brutally murdered in her Lakeland, Florida home in October 1986, the Polk County Sheriff's Office said in a statement. They identified Scalf's neighbor at the time, Donald Douglas, as her killer, using blood samples from the scene that they recently matched to Douglas's son using modern DNA technology. The sample did not garner any matches for more than 3 decades, according to the statement. Police worked with Othram Inc., a private lab for forensic genetic genealogy, to narrow down the pool of suspects. They followed the information they discovered, which led them to Douglas's son, who cooperated with a blood sample, which was then used to connect Douglas to the case. It isn't clear who had the illicit relationship in the family. Reports state it was an affair involving Douglas's third cousin, who had a child. A detective who was speaking with distant family members of Douglas was informed by one member that it was an affair, the Polk County Sheriff's Department stated, but could not confirm further details of the affair. When the detective was building a family tree for the case, one branch sprouted off due to the affair, which eventually led detectives back to Lakeland and Douglas. The Sheriff's Department said in their statement that the attack on Scalf was sexually motivated, and that her throat had been slit. They did not have any suspects at the time. Scalf's family said she had mentioned a stalkerish neighbor before her death. Douglas was interviewed by the police after the murder, but detectives could not find a link between him and the case. Scalf's mother, Betty Scalf, found her body in her home after she did not show up to work. She suspected that evidence had been washed away by the rain by the time she arrived at the home. Teresa had an 8-year-old son who was not home at the time of the murder. Douglas' son was in horrible shock, Sheriff Grady Judd said. Douglas died of natural causes in 2008 at 54, the sheriff's office said. He was 33 at the time of Scalf's murder. The case is now considered closed. Scalf's family members praised the sheriff's office for finally confirming the killer. "I'm 84 years old. I lived to see this done," said Scalf's mother Betty during a news conference announcing that the case had been closed. "I think that's why I lived so long." DNA evidence preserved after a 1956 double homicide and the use of forensic genealogy has helped a Montana sheriff's office close the books on the 65-year-old cold case. Investigators with the Cascade County Sheriff's Office concluded Kenneth Gould, who died in Oregon County, Missouri, in 2007, more than likely killed Patricia Kalitzke, 16, and Duane Bogle, 18. Both were shot in the head. Detective Sergeant John Cadner, who took over the case in 2012, said it was the oldest case he could find nationwide that has been solved using forensic genealogy, which searches commercial DNA databases to find familial matches to the DNA of a crime suspect. Cadner was able to eliminate several rape suspects through DNA testing, including notorious crime boss James Whitey Bulger, who had actually been in the area and had been arrested for rape in 1951. On January 3, 1956, 3 boys hiking along the Sun River near Wadsworth Park northwest of Great Falls found Bogle dead near his car. A day later, a county road worker found Kalitzke's body north of Great Falls. Kalitzke was a junior at Great Falls High School, and Bogle was an airman at Malmstrom Air Force Base from Waco, Texas. Officers investigated for years, but they were unable to make an arrest. The case went cold for decades until 2001, when then-Detective Phil Madison sent the slide of a vaginal swab gathered from Kalitzke's body to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The lab found a sperm cell that did not belong to Bogle, officers said. When Madison retired, he said he didn't believe the case would be solved. A lot of different people had a turn at this, and we just weren't able to take it to conclusion," he said. In 2018, however, forensic genealogy, which was used to help adoptees find biological family members, was used to identify Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. as the Golden State Killer. The new method has led to the identification of dozens of suspects in cold cases. In 2019, Cascade County detectives had Bode Technology perform additional DNA testing on the evidence found on Kalitzke's body. It was uploaded to voluntary genealogical databases, where they discovered a possible family connection, leading investigators to Gould. Cadner had to reach out to Gould's children and ask for DNA samples to verify the match. "I wasn't sure how they were going to react when I come to them saying, 'Hey, your dad's a suspect in this case,' but they were great to work with," Cadner said. Gould's family home at the time of the homicides was a little over a mile from where Kalitzke lived. He was known to ride horses through the area, officials said. After the murders, Gould sold his property near the town of Tracy. His family lived in the Montana communities of Geraldine and Hamilton before moving to Missouri in 1967. They did not return to Montana. Gould did not have a known criminal history and was not interviewed during the murder investigation. Investigators did not find any connections between Gould and the victims. "Officers kept working the case because of the circumstances," Cadner said. "You had two young, vibrant individuals that were well-liked among their peer group," he said. "Investigators poured their heart and soul into this case. They leave a little bit of themselves from what I've seen." On April 8, 1981, Gordon and Karen Alexander were found stabbed in their home by police officers. Gordon was found dead in the kitchen, police said, and his sister Karen was found alive on her bed near the living room area. Karen Alexander was 14 and her brother 13, according to a press report from the time. Karen was rushed to the hospital, where she died from her injuries shortly afterward, police said. Detectives knew that the young girl had been raped. There was no forced entry, and at the time of the murders, the mother was a mental health patient at Wadley Hospital, and the father left for work the evening before at 12 p.m. An autopsy at the time revealed that Karen had been sexually assaulted 48 to 72 hours before she died and had likely been sexually assaulted for about 6 months leading up to her death. Weldon was working an overnight shift at Copper Tire and Rubber. Weldon arrived home from work shortly after 7 a.m. when he claimed that both the screen door and the wooden front door were slightly open. He said he walked inside and found his son dead in the kitchen, and he thought his daughter might still be alive on her bed near the living room area. Weldon told police that he removed a kitchen knife from Karen's body and put it on a nearby bookshelf before officers arrived. Detectives interviewed persons of interest and gathered information, but didn't have enough information for an arrest. In 1983, serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the Alexander sibling killings. But since there was no evidence backing that, the case went cold. In 2022, the Alexander case was reopened, with Captain Calvin Seward heading the investigation. When the murders happened, Seward, then a patrol officer, was assigned to interview persons of interest. His dedication to solving the murders stayed because his daughter went to school with Karen, said Seward. Over the course of the next 18 months, Seward identified and interviewed people linked to the original investigation. DNA was extracted from fingernail tissue from the siblings for testing, said Dr. Todd Steffi, a forensic criminologist who worked with Texarkana police on the case. The test determined that Weldon Alexander's semen was discovered on Karen's bedding. Weldon is their father. Also, evidence taken from the dried blood found on Gordon's hands and Karen's body contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which were materials used in the construction of tires at Copper Tire and Rubber, where their father worked. At a press conference on October 19th, Texarkana Police Chief Michael Cram announced that Weldon Alexander is believed to have fatally stabbed his 14-year-old daughter Karen Alexander and 13-year-old son Gordon Alexander in 1981. Police said the suspect died in 2014. Seward said he was surprised by the investigation's conclusion, as detectives had earlier thought the time of death was later in the morning. They later found out that was wrong, and that the brother's body was cold when detectives arrived, leading them to conclude he had been dead for hours. Seward said he believes the father attacked his daughter to rape her, and then the brother tried to defend his sister. The father then stabbed the daughter and son. Miller County prosecuting attorney Connie Mitchell said she's confident that Weldon is the sole suspect in the murders, and believes that if he was alive today, she would be requesting an arrest warrant for 2 counts of capital murder. In 1983 and then 1986, the villages of Narborough and Enderby were shaken by the deaths of 2 local teenage girls who were attacked and killed in very similar circumstances. On November 21, 1983, 15-year-old Lynda Mann took a shortcut on her way home from babysitting. When she did not return home, her parents and neighbors spent the night searching for her. The next morning, she was found raped and strangled on a deserted footpath known locally as the Black Pad. There were not enough leads or enough evidence to connect anybody to the murder, and the case was left open. 3 years later, on July 31, 1986, a second 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, left her home to visit a friend's house. 2 days later, her body was found in a wooded area near a footpath called 10-Pound Lane. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. Police linked the 2 attacks as having possibly been carried out by the same person, and forensic evidence revealed the same blood type. DNA profiling was first developed in 1985 by Alec Jeffries, along with Peter Gill and Dave Wirrett. One of the key factors of their work would prove invaluable in rape cases. It meant that police were able to link a semen sample taken from Mann's body to a person with type A blood and an enzyme profile that matched only 10% of males. Gill said at the time, "The biggest achievement was developing the preferential extraction method to separate sperm from vaginal cells. Without this method, it would have been difficult to use DNA in rape cases." Using this technique, Jeffries compared semen samples from both murder victims against a blood sample from the initial suspect, Richard Buckland, and conclusively proved that both girls were killed by the same man, which wasn't Buckland. He became the first person to have his innocence established by DNA fingerprinting. The police then tested the DNA of 5,500 local men, but with no positive matches. On August 1, 1987, Ian Kelly, a colleague of Colin Pitchfork, a bakery worker from Newbold Verdon, Leicestershire, revealed in a Leicester pub that he had taken Pitchfork's blood test for him, helping him to fake it. Pitchfork had told Kelly that he could not give blood under his own name because he had already given blood while pretending to be a friend of his who had been convicted for burglary. A woman overheard the conversation and then reported it to police. On September 19, 1987, Pitchfork was arrested, and his DNA matched that of the sample found on the girls' bodies. He pleaded guilty to the 2 rape and murders, in addition to another incident of sexual assault, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Secretary of State set a minimum term of 30 years for his sentence, but in 2009 it was reduced on appeal to 28 years. In July 2021, it was announced he would be released from prison after the parole board rejected a government challenge to keep him locked up. In June 2021, the government called for a review into Pitchfork's risk after the parole board announced that they were satisfied he was safe to be released. However, the parole board rejected the government challenge against its ruling, and Pitchfork, now 61, was released in September. The government challenge from Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland had claimed the decision to free Pitchfork was irrational because the parole board panel failed to give sufficient reasons as to why it agreed with the evidence provided by professionals. However, Judge Michael Topolsky Queen's counsel, who reviewed the decision for the parole board, said he did not agree that the decision was irrational and decided that application for reconsideration is refused. This was and remains a case of considerable seriousness, complexity, and notoriety, he added. The terrible consequences of the brutal rapes and murders of 2 innocent girls will forever darken the lives of the families concerned. He's now subject to 36 strict monitoring conditions on top of the standard restrictions placed on anyone serving part of their sentence in the community. When he is released from prison, Pitchfork will still be subject to strict license conditions. Yara Gambirasio should only have been gone a short while. On Friday, November 26, 2010, at 5:15 p.m., she left home to go to the gym, just a few hundred meters from her home. Yara, who was 13 and wore train track braces, was preparing for her rhythmic gymnastics display the following Sunday. All she needed to do was drop off a stereo with her instructor. She said goodbye to her family, who knew where she was going, and left the house. By 7 p.m., Yara had still not come home, and her parents were becoming increasingly anxious. The town where they lived, Brembate de Sopra, was a sedate place, on the so-called Bergamasque Island, between the rivers Brembo and Adda. An hour north of Milan and just south of the Bergamo Alps, it has a population of 8,000. From its quiet streets, lined with poplars and cypresses, you can see the wooded mountains in the distance, the peaks turning blue-gray. At 7:11 p.m., Yara's mother phoned her daughter, but the call went straight to voicemail. 20 minutes later, Yara's father called the police. The call was put through to the public prosecutor's office, in the center of the provincial capital Bergamo, a city 6.8 miles east of Brembate di Sopra. The magistrate on duty was Letizia Ruggeri, 45, a tough former policewoman who had earned her stripes fighting Cosa Nostra in Sicily. She had been a magistrate for almost 15 years and knew what needed to be done. Within minutes, she had dispatched both state police officers and carabinieri, military police, to Brembate di Sopra. Yara's gym instructor confirmed that she had seen the teenager earlier that day and that she had done some light training before heading off. The police quickly established that the last known contact with Yara was a text message she had sent to a friend, Martina, at 6:44 p.m., agreeing to meet at 8 on the following Sunday. That was the last anyone heard from her. The gym was part of a large sports complex, a garish building with many entrances and exits. Besides the large sports hall, there was a running track, a swimming pool, and various courts. A few people said they'd seen 2 men, possibly in conversation with Yara, standing near a red car, but there was little more to go on than that. Ruggeri called in tracker dogs. Instead of following the expected route back to Yara's home in Via Rampinelli, Ruggeri's dogs went in the opposite direction, towards a small hamlet nearby called Mapello. When the team analyzed the last signals from Yara's mobile phone, the results showed that it had been registered as present in Mapello at 1849 that evening. Everything seemed to point away from Yara's family, but investigations of this type always start at home. Over the next few days, Ruggeri and her team questioned every member of the Gambirasio family, looking for signs of discord or dark secrets. Yara's parents were well known and respected. Her father, Fulvio, was a large, solid man with thick glasses, an architect whose father had been the local postman, like his mother before him. Mara, Fulvio's wife, was a teacher in Longwillow, a nearby town. The marriage appeared strong. They had 4 children. Yara had an older sister, Keba, 15, and 2 younger brothers, Natan and Jawil, both under 10. Ruggeri put wiretaps on hundreds of phones. Her team also tried to trace the owners of all the handsets, some 15,000, which had passed through Mapello on the day of Yara's disappearance. One of these belonged to a Moroccan man called Mohamed Fikri. In one wiretapped conversation, in late November, the interpreter heard the phrase, "Forgive me, God. I didn't kill her." Fikri had been working in a builder's yard in Mapello, but by the time investigators had put the pieces together a few days later, he was on a boat bound for Tangiers. On December 4th, Italian authorities intercepted the vessel and arrested Fikri. They searched the van he had been using and discovered that it contained a blood-stained mattress. People liked him as the guilty party, Ruggery stated, because he was foreign. But Fikri was quickly cleared. The phrase had been mistranslated, and the blood was extraneous to the investigation. As autumn slipped into winter, Brembate de Sopra found itself at the center of a mystery which had captured the country's imagination. Italian TV is dominated by crime news, and now national camera crews descended. The Gambirasio family were horrified by the sudden glare of publicity. TV cameras became a permanent fixture in their quiet cul-de-sac. The family locked themselves away, lowering their shutters and even turning down the idea of a torchlight procession to raise awareness. Instead, nuns from the Ursuline order, who taught at Yara's school, came to pray with Mara. A mass was held instead of the procession, and the rare statements from the parents were devout pleas for privacy and patience. Desperate to discover the whereabouts of their daughter, the Gambirasio family did share some photographs of Yara with the press in the days after her disappearance. Yara queuing to take communion, doing the splits in the gym, a studio photo of her in a yellow top, in an Italy football shirt, on the beach. But no one came forward with any useful information. When her parents finally made a televised appeal, a few days after their first Christmas without Yara, they looked awkward. Mara was so uncomfortable she was, unintentionally, rolling her eyes. Fulvio, who wore a rugby shirt, hesitantly read a plea, "Help us return to normality." He explained that the family values were love, respect, and honesty, and that they would be giving no interviews. This wariness towards outsiders owes much to the region's history. Bergamo is still called, in local dialect, Bergam, an old name which means the town of the mountain. The city has always been a strategically important citadel, one of the last redoubts before the flat, fertile basin of the River Po. The Bergamaschi are used to seeing off invasions. Just a few miles west of Brembate de Sopra is a small town called Pontida, where in 1167 the Lombard League, the alliance of northern Italian cities, which joined together to resist the German Holy Roman Emperor. The Oath of Pontida still exerts a symbolic power today. It's frequently evoked by the separatists of the Northern League to rally sentiment against outsiders, against the perceived indolence and corruption of southern Italy, or, more commonly now, against immigrants from developing nations. This setting was part of what fascinated the Italian public about Yara's disappearance. The province of Bergamo seemed to represent two different sides of the country. Where Lower Bergamo, towards the plains, is fashionable, well-connected and industrialized, Alpine Bergamo is agricultural, remote, and deeply traditional, a close-knit place which nurtures suspicion, even superstition. Some locals talk, without irony, of this being a land of stresh, of witches, who steal or poison young children. Yara's disappearance has continued to grip the Italian public over the years, becoming one of the most extraordinary and sophisticated criminal investigations in Italian history. When Ruggery, the chief investigator, was asked about the case, she stared at her desk and just said "incredible" 4 times. On the afternoon of February 26, 2011, exactly 3 months after Yara disappeared, a middle-aged man named Ilario Scotti was flying his radio-controlled plane in the small town of Cignolo de Sola, 6 miles south of Brembate de Sopra. Cignolo is surrounded by industrial estates, and the scrubland by Via Badeschi seemed like a safe, unpopulated place for Scotty to try out his new model aircraft. The model airplane wasn't functioning as Scotty wanted, though, so he brought it down to earth amid the tall weeds. As he picked up his plane, he caught sight of some rags on the ground nearby. At first, he thought someone had been fly tipping. Then he saw the shoes. Ruggery was coming back from a day's skiing with her daughter when she got the call that a body had been found. She dropped her daughter at home and went straight to the crime scene. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but Ruggery could see the black bomber jacket with its elasticated waist, which Yara had been wearing when she left home in November. There, too, was her Hello Kitty sweatshirt. Crime scene investigators found Yara's iPod and house keys, as well as the SIM card and battery for her LG phone. The phone itself was missing. It was a relief, Ruggery stated. Yara's disappearance had really disturbed me. I'm a mother too. And the only thing worse than the death of a child is the disappearance of a child. The autopsy was conducted by Italy's most famous forensic pathologist, Professor Cristina Cattaneo. She discovered traces of lime in Yara's respiratory passages and the presence of jute, a vegetable fiber used to make rope, on her clothing. Yara hadn't been raped, although her purple bra was unhooked. She had suffered multiple injuries from a sharp weapon which had pierced her clothing at various points. It seemed that she had been attacked and abandoned. She had died of exposure. The presence of lime and jute suggested the killer might be in the building trade. The forensics team retrieved 2 DNA samples, one from Yara's phone battery and the other from 2 fingers of her black gloves, but neither matched any samples the authorities had on record. 2 months later, in April, the commander of the Scientific Investigations Department in Parma phoned Ruggery. "I've got good news," he told her. "This murder has a signature. We've found male DNA on the underwear of the deceased. It was likely that the murderer had himself been wounded in the struggle, leaving his DNA on the girl's knickers." Ruggery and her team named the murder suspect Ignota 1, Unknown 1. Now the hunt for Yara's killer could begin in earnest. The workload was huge, and Ruggery divided up the duties. The police were responsible for taking DNA samples from family members, from school friends, and people in the gym. The Carabinieri concentrated on the phone records, cross-referencing all the mobile phones that had moved from Brembate de Sopra to Cignolo di Sola on November 26, 2010. Each phone user whose number appeared in both cells was tracked down and asked for a DNA sample. It was slow and laborious work. It took geneticists in Parma, Pavia, and Rome a minimum of 6 hours to transform just a few samples of DNA into something which could be read and compared on a computer screen. The cost, in machinery and manpower, was immense, and the investigation would go on to become one of the most expensive manhunts in Italian history. Yara's funeral took place on a hot morning in late May 2011. Onlookers applauded the white coffin, which was topped with a huge bouquet of white flowers, as the hearse slowly drove towards her gym. The ceremony took place in the sports hall, where she had spent so many hours training, and where she had last been seen alive. Outside, a large crowd watched the funeral on a giant screen and heard the condolences of Giorgio Napolitano, the President of the Republic. By the time of the funeral, investigators had taken thousands of DNA samples, but they still had no leads. Close to the scrubland where Yara's body had been found was a nightclub called Sabby Mobile, Quicksand. Ruggery knew that murderers tend to dump bodies in areas with which they're very familiar. So although it seemed like a long shot, in spring 2011 investigators started taking DNA samples outside the club on busy Fridays and Saturdays. Sabby Mobile had a reputation for violence. A young man from the Dominican Republic had been murdered outside its doors on January 16, 2011. But the club had helpful records. Clubbers required a membership card to get in, and so the authorities could easily track down anyone who went there regularly. Ruggery finally got a break. One of the samples from Sabi Mobile seemed strikingly similar to the suspect. Ignota 1. The man who gave the sample was called Damiano Guarinoni. He was quickly excluded as a suspect. He had been in South America on the day of Yara's disappearance, but geneticists were convinced he was a close relative of the murderer. We were all very excited, Ruggieri told me. We said, "Bingo, just a couple of more days, and we'll have the murderer." As Ruggieri and her team put together the jigsaw of Guarinoni's family, they made an astonishing discovery. Damiano Guarinoni's mother, Aurora Zani, had worked for 10 years as a domestic help in the Gambirasio home. She lived nearby and had gone to Yara's home twice a week throughout the young girl's childhood. Zani was a middle-aged woman who was very attached to her employers. She recalled how Yara would always ask her to watch her latest gymnastics moves, and Zani would tell her to be careful not to hurt herself. In 2011, she was no longer working for the family, but said her relationship with Yara's parents was excellent. To find herself at the center of the investigation into Yara's murder was, Zani said later, the worst thing that could happen to me. Obviously, Ruggieri says, we intercepted Damiano Guarinoni and Aurora Zani's calls, had them followed. It was only after months of close surveillance that Ruggieri, in the summer of 2011, resigned herself to the fact that it was just a crazy coincidence. There was no connection, she says. You couldn't make it up. This whole case is crazy. Having seemed so close to a resolution, Ruggieri's team reluctantly discarded the angle of the domestic help. The only promising lead they still had was the fact that Damiano Guarinoni's DNA was so similar to that of Ignota 1. A year on from Yara's murder, Ruggieri's team was now under intense pressure to find the killer. Thousands of people were being DNA tested, and some locals who hadn't been approached for a sample suggested to the press that the investigation was haphazard. Politicians made personal attacks on Ruggieri. One Northern League politician, Daniele Bellotti, publicly decried her incompetence, writing an open letter in January 2012 to the Minister of Justice, asking for her to be replaced by someone of proven experience. Ruggieri filed a lawsuit against Bellotti for libel on April 20, 2012, taking particular objection to his characterization of her as a person of low technical and moral profile. Behind these criticisms of Ruggieri was a strong undercurrent of sexism. What hope was there that this woman could solve such a complex crime? She was unconventional, a single mother with long hair and 5 earrings in her left ear. She played classical guitar, rode to work on an old Vespa, and had a black belt in karate. Ruggieri felt she was also being targeted because she had decided to drop the case against the Moroccan laborer, Mohamed Fikri. Many people thought I had made the wrong decision, Ruggieri told me, and they held it against me. The criticism was ferocious. I found it very tough. Ruggieri decided to concentrate on the only promising lead she had, the Guarinoni DNA. Her team spent months recreating the Guarinoni family tree. When I visited her office last year, Ruggieri pulled out a folder and showed me hundreds of names. Each one annotated, dates of birth, places of birth, relationships within the family. The investigators had worked out a complete genealogical tree as far back as 1815, with other branches of the family going back as far as 1716. The roots of that family tree were in the small village of Gorno. It's only 45 minutes drive north of Bergamo itself, up the narrow Siriana Valley, but it feels like another world. You arrive through a series of hairpin bends into a village that smells of wood smoke and chickens. In the distance, you can hear the sound of waterfalls and cowbells. The village is full of narrow flights of steps. The only horizontal patch of land is a sandy 5-a-side football pitch. Although only 1,600 people live in Gorno, and it seems like a quiet, pious place, according to one former parish, the village is a bit too hot in every sense. Let's say they're a bit promiscuous. In 2011, 2 people in Gorno were murdered in unrelated incidents. The same families have been here for centuries, and on the village's war memorial, outside the small church, the names of Benedetto and Pietro Guarinoni are carved into the stone. The Guarinoni family were nicknamed I Font, the infantry, considered by everyone to be loyal, strong, even hot-headed. Damiano Guarinoni's father had a brother, Giuseppe, who had died in 1999. Investigators visited Giuseppe's widow in September 2011 and found 2 stamps he had licked, one in order to validate his driving license, and another on a postcard he had sent to his family. When DNA results came back from that sample, they had another breakthrough. Geneticists were convinced that Giuseppe Guarinoni was the father of Ignoto 1, the suspected murderer. Ruggeri's team quickly built up a picture of Giuseppe Guarinoni and his family. Giuseppe himself, a thick-set man with a rugged face, had been a bus driver who played the accordion at village festivals. His marriage to Laura Poli had seemed conventional. They had 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. Laura had become a Jehovah's Witness, and after her husband's death had moved to a nearby town, Clusone. Since Ignoto 1 was male, investigators concentrated on the sons, Pierpaolo and Diego. Pierpaolo was like his mother, a Jehovah's Witness. Diego had a drug problem. Neither provided a perfect match with Ignoto 1, however, and neither of them had children. If Ignoto 1 really was the son of the late Giuseppe Guarinoni, the only explanation was that, somewhere out there, was his illegitimate child. It became, Ruggeri says, an investigation within an investigation. She was now hunting a woman, presumably in middle to old age, who 30 or 40 years ago had had an affair with a married man, now long dead, and given birth to a boy who went on to murder Yara Gambirasio. It proved extremely difficult for investigators to penetrate the mountain villages, Ponte Selva, Pare, Clusone, and Rovetta, where they were looking for clues and leads. Some Italian journalists spoke of the cocchiotaghine, or pig-headedness, of the Bergamo Alps, a caricature which only served to antagonize the already defensive locals. The people here were irritated by the stereotype of Highlanders closed in on themselves. The word omerta was even used, which implies the silence of Sicily and the mafia. It was deeply offensive. There was incomprehension on both sides. The investigation was, by Italian standards, unusually secretive. Locals couldn't understand why police hunting the murderer of a 13-year-old girl were taking DNA samples of elderly women. Locals felt there was something cold about this investigation, with its invasive demands for DNA samples, and it was changing the atmosphere in these small communities. People thought that the murderer was here, amongst us. So there was a sort of not panic, but fear. Investigators knew that from the early 1960s onwards, for 2 weeks every May, Giuseppe Guarinoni used to go to a spa resort called Salis Terme, south of Milan, without his wife. Throughout the spring of 2012, Ruggeri's teams scoured records and registers, tracking all the women who had stayed in the resort at the same time of year as Guarinoni. They searched orphanages and homes for fallen women. They tested single mothers and women who had left the mountains for Lower Bergamo. They came up empty-handed. The woman they were looking for, they realized, was probably neither single nor fallen, but hidden behind the walls of a marriage. Divorce was only legalized in Italy in 1970. Until that time, many couples had stayed together, despite infidelities. By the time Ruggeri was searching for Ignoto 1's mother, Yara's parents had hired their own expert, a freelance geneticist, in order to review the investigation and explain it to them. For almost a year, Giorgio Portera lobbied for the exhumation of Giuseppe Guarinoni's body from the cemetery in Gorno. He was concerned that investigators has only been able to compare 13 short tandem repeat regions, which are sequences of DNA, with the DNA of Ignoto 1. Confirmation of paternity demands that at least 15 STR regions be compared. So early on March 7, 2013, workmen chiseled into Gerinoni's locolo, the horizontal slot in a cemetery wall where his coffin was kept, and removed his remains. They were transferred by Carabinieri to the Papa Giovanni Hospital in Bergamo for examination, before being returned to Gorno just a few hours later. A couple of camera crews and a few bewildered villagers watched. When DNA was extracted from his remains, 29 STR regions could be compared. It was now absolutely certain that Gerinoni was the father of Ignoto 1. As the investigation dragged on through 2013, the public slowly became aware of why a woman was being sought. It became common knowledge that the late Giuseppe Gerinoni had had a lover, and that she was thought to be the mother of the murderer. "We have rediscovered," wrote one journalist, "that accursed desire for gossip, which spices up small-town life. Now, here, everyone wants to know whose son so-and-so is." Long-forgotten infidelities and old suspicions surfaced. Bonichelli laughs as he describes how his journalists discovered 5 illegitimate children in 2 small villages. 5. "We could have started a gossip magazine. It was like an open sewer. We were receiving anonymous letters, stories, people telling us about backgrounds and cuckolds. A society which had always prided itself on its sense of loyalty and traditional Catholicism suddenly discovered the betrayals in its midst. Perhaps the point is this," Bonichelli wrote in an editorial. "We don't know each other anymore." Until this point, the investigation had been characterized by cutting-edge, scientific analysis. But it was an old-fashioned detective who broke the case open. Marshal Giovanni Moccherino was Ruggeri's right-hand man, working in the office next to hers. His desk is covered in hundreds of scraps of paper, scrawled with names and numbers in different colored inks. Moccherino has bushy gray hair and black-rimmed glasses and speaks in a light-hearted, informal manner. But he's also, by his own admission, a capotosta, a stubborn man. Although Moccherino was born in the south, near Naples, he had lived in the Bergamo Alps area since 1983, and he had come to know the region well. He was always talking with local people, and sensitized, as he said, thousands to the case. He reminded them that, amid all the gossip about infidelities that had been sparked off by the hunt for Gerinoni's lover, a young girl had been killed. By 2013, he knew everything about Gerinoni's life, born in Gorno. Gerinoni had moved in the mid-1960s to Ponteselva, a nearby settlement which had grown up around the bridge over the Sirio River. He drove a public bus for the Modolini, later Saab Bus Company. In the 1960s and 70s, he would have driven plenty of young women to and from jobs in the various textile factories. Moccherino questioned Gerinoni's fellow bus drivers, one of whom had already gone to the press in March 2013, saying that Gerinoni had confessed to having got a young woman in trouble. Another former colleague described Gerinoni as a womanizer. But it wasn't until June 2014 that one of Moccherino's sources finally gave him the name he was looking for. Moccherino refused to confirm who first whispered the name of the mystery woman to him, but however it came about, investigators had the final piece of the jigsaw, Esther Arzuffi. Arzuffi had been a neighbor of Gerinoni's in Ponteselva in the late 1960s. In 1966, aged 19, she had married Gianni Bassetti from Pare, a nearby village. Bassetti was a man whose tough life had turned him inwards. He had been orphaned young and suffered from psoriasis, arthrosis, and depression. Arzuffi seemed very different, an outgoing, good-looking woman. She wore short skirts and dyed her hair. She got a job at the textile factory a few miles away in Villa Dogna and took the bus every day. Ruggeri's team immediately cross-checked the DNA samples they had and discovered that Arzuffi had already been tested in July 2012. They double-checked and realized that a basic error had been made by a geneticist in Rome. Arzuffi's DNA had been compared not to Ignoto one's, but to Yara's. Now investigators hurriedly reran the test and discovered that Arellano was indeed the woman they had spent so long looking for. She was the mother of Ignota 1. Arellano had left Ponte Selva in 1970, but she had continued her affair with Guarinoni, and in the autumn of 1970, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The boy was called Massimo Bassetti. His middle name was Giuseppe, like his biological father, a slim boy who loved to party. He was nicknamed the Animal by his friends. He was now 42, a builder, married with 3 children and living in Mapello, the hamlet near Yara's hometown, where the last signal from Yara's cell phone had been recorded on November 26, 2010. He was short, with piercing blue eyes, and had a peroxided pencil goatee. Ruggieri moved fast. On June 15, 2014, she set up a fake roadblock breathalyzing drivers. When her police officers stopped Massimo Bassetti, they pretended the machine hadn't worked the first time, so they could get 2 good samples. His DNA was immediately sent for overnight tests, and results showed it was an exact match with Ignota 1. Ruggieri wanted to observe Bassetti before arresting him, to study his movements and behavior from a distance. But she was also worried that the news would get out, and that he might leave town. On June 16th, Bassetti was arrested and charged with the murder of Yara Gambirasio. The Italian Home Secretary himself released a statement announcing his arrest. Reaction in the mountains of Bergamo, center of the investigation, was relief. The murder suspect was from Lower Bergamo. Investigators discovered plenty of circumstantial evidence. Bassetti had frequently hung around Yara's house. He parked his car in Via Don Sala, behind the gym, and ate at the Toscanacchia pizzeria at the end of her road. He had gone for regular UV showers at a tanning shop nearby. His internet searches were troubling, using search words which implied a compulsion for pubescent young girls. More pertinently, records suggested that his phone had been present in Brembate de Sopra on the evening of Yara's disappearance, but had been switched off from 5:45 p.m. until the following morning at 7:34 a.m. For Ruggieri, the arrest was the reward for almost 4 years of dogged investigative work. After enduring a barrage of criticism for alleged incompetence, she was now feted for her brilliance. Bassetti maintains his innocence, and his lawyers are planning to contest the DNA evidence, claiming that DNA merely indicates presence, not responsibility. Meanwhile, 3 families are dealing with the devastation of the case. Guarinoni's widow has been forced, in the autumn of her life, to come to terms with her husband's infidelity and the existence of his other children. Meanwhile, just as he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, Giovanni Bassetti became the nation's most famous cuckold. Learning at the same time as the rest of the country that none of his 3 children are his, leaks from the investigation revealed that Esther Arzuffi's 3rd child, Fabio, also had a different father. The marriage of the accused, Massimo Bassetti, has also come under strain, since his defense sought to portray him as a family man. 2 people have come forward to claim that they had affairs with his wife. Such is the local loathing for Bassetti that since his arrest, his twin sister, herself coming to terms with both her brother's fate, and the fact that the man she thought was her father is not biologically related to her, has twice been beaten up. Her mother, Esther Arzuffi, still denies that she's ever been unfaithful to her husband. Massimo Bassetti was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Gambirasio family, meanwhile, has remained private. Recently, awarding a gymnastics trophy named after her daughter, Yara Gambirasio struggled to smile and made no public comments. She's cut her hair short and looks gaunt. Yara is buried between her 2 grandparents in a cemetery just across the road from her gym. There's no date on her tombstone, only a signature next to a photograph of her wearing a white Alice band. All around the grave are mementos left by her friends: gym shoes, a metal tulip, rag dolls, plastic angels, and little bracelets. Often, in the early evening, you see Yara's father, Fulvio, standing here, gazing at the resting place of his parents and his daughter. On January 30th, 1996, the body of an unidentified woman was found 30 feet off the main road at the bottom of a ravine in the Topanga Canyon area of Malibu. The body was partially clothed, leading investigators to suspect sexual assault. In the days following, the body was identified as Gladys Arellano, who was last seen 2 days earlier at her home in Boyle Heights. She was reported missing by her family. An autopsy later determined that Arellano had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. Detectives had a DNA profile created using evidence recovered from the ravine. That DNA profile was loaded into the California state database as well as the federal system. For years, authorities waited for a hit. Homicide investigators weren't able to get much further, and for over 2 decades, the case remained unsolved. But when Luis Garcia, the accused killer, was arrested in November 2019 by Los Angeles police for domestic assault, his DNA sample matched the DNA taken from Arellano's body in 1996. The case was ultimately solved by Detective Joe Purcell of the Sheriff's Homicide Bureau Unsolved Case Unit, which is made up of 12 retired homicide investigators who work part-time solving murder cases using new technologies and anonymous tips. Purcell obtained a search warrant to get an oral swab from Garcia, which they used to confirm the DNA match. In 2020, investigators in California announced that newly developed DNA evidence helped them crack a nearly 25-year-old cold case, and that they had arrested a Texas man in connection with the 1996 death of Gladys Arellano, a teenage girl whose remains were recovered from the bottom of a ravine in Malibu. Jose Luis Garcia, 43, was arrested in September 2020. The Dallas man was extradited to Los Angeles County last week. Garcia was 18 at the time of the death of Arellano. His bail has been set at $1 million. It was a day the loved ones of Gladys Arellano had been waiting decades for. They were able to see her suspected killer in court as he pled guilty to kidnapping and voluntary manslaughter. Garcia faces 19 years in prison for Gladys Arellano's death. Jose Luis Garcia pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter in connection with the death of Gladys Arellano, along with 1 count each of kidnapping and domestic assault involving the teen, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Gladys Arellano's sisters and best friend told the court what Garcia did nearly destroyed them, as they wondered for more than 25 years what happened to her. It was tough, but it felt really good to finally get it off your chest, and actually, seeing him, and releasing it, and having some kind of comfort, said Vanessa Arellano, Gladys Arellano's younger sister.
National in this country on a student visa, she was about to graduate from UNO with a double major. Why did her life come to a tragic end last weekend?
We haven't ruled out anything. We're following every possible avenue.
Her body was found north of Council Bluffs without clothes and with a cut throat. An autopsy already shows she died somewhere else, but it does not yet show if she had been sexually assaulted. Last seen on the UNO campus Saturday night, the victim may have been abducted. Or was her death because of the political situation in Iran? Ms. Dehghanpour was the subject of a recent article in the Sun newspapers about Iranians living in Omaha. She was identified only as the feminist, but the description given did not make it difficult to figure out who she was. In the article, she spoke of her opposition to the government of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The reporter who interviewed her said she seemed concerned but not frightened of pro-Khomeini factions.
She referred to them as the agents of Khomeini, which I assume would be supporters of the Ayatollah, who live and function as students in Omaha.
Iranian friends of the victim we've talked to also have concerns of a political murder, but authorities discount that theory.
Offhand, it looks like your typical, I hate to say typical, but it looks like an abduction murder to me at this point.
Firozeh Dehghanpour was a 27-year-old University of Nebraska-Omaha student from Iran. In August 1983, her body was found under a bridge near Pigeon Creek in Council Bluffs, Iowa, by fishermen. Investigators said her body was found naked, beaten, and with a slashed throat. The blood from the scene was tested and 2 DNA profiles were identified. Several agencies worked together to try to find Firozeh's killer. Unfortunately, her murder went unsolved for almost 4 decades. Roughly 37 years, Sergeant James Doty led the renewed investigation after receiving a tip in late 2020. Sheriff's Office investigators followed up on leads, and crime scene technician Hadley Kava examined evidence collected nearly 4 decades earlier. The evidence, including a bra, underwear, blouse, notebooks, computer printouts, work glove, prescription glasses, beer can, and 2 pens, had been stored at the sheriff's office for nearly 4 decades. Investigators stated that a blood-stained glove found at the scene contained Dehghanpour's DNA and that of a male. They were able to match the unidentified DNA to Bud Leroy Christensen through the National Combined DNA Index System CODIS. Investigators also found Christensen's fingerprints on papers that had been found near the body, authorities said. Bud Leroy Christensen, a registered sex offender, was the only possible suspect. He was arrested in May 2021 in Omaha, Nebraska. After the 2021 arrest, Kava said, "Let Firozeh's case be an example that it's never too late to seek justice." Kava said Christensen hasn't given a reason for the murder since his arrest. He only pleaded guilty. "It's not the ending everybody wants. You know, you always want to know the why," she said. Kava said while there's no proof of why he did it, the crime was full of hate. "It was certainly, in my opinion, a hate crime against women," she said. He targeted a woman. He's targeted women in the past, or he's been at least convicted of that." Christensen is a registered sex offender in Nebraska, earning lifetime offender status because of 3 past sex crime convictions. He pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree sexual assault and first-degree false imprisonment in the most recent 2014 case and was later released from prison in May 2018. The murder of Lynette White in 1988 led to one of Britain's most notorious miscarriages of justice. Her killer was finally jailed in 2003 after 15 years. But what else do we know about her and the murder? Lynette White was murdered on February 14, 1988, in her Docklands flat in Cardiff. Before the fatal incident, the 20-year-old had been working as a prostitute in the city centre. 5 days before her murder, White went missing and made no contact with any of her friends or known associates. The reason for her disappearance during this period has never been ascertained. She was due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials, but was reportedly laying low. On the evening of February 14th, police forced entry into a flat on James Street as they searched for the missing witness and found Lynette's body inside. She had been stabbed more than 60 times by an unknown assailant. After the murder, South Wales police issued a photo-fit image of a blood-stained white male seen near the scene of the crime, but were unable to trace him. In November 1988, police charged 5 black and mixed-race men with Lynette's murder, despite having no scientific evidence linked to them being at the crime scene. The men, who became known as the Cardiff Five, were unexpectedly arrested in response to local yacht club secretary Violet Perriam telling detectives she remembered seeing a number of suspicious black men near the flat where Lynette was killed. The 5 men were quickly accused of the murder, despite the police having previously said they were looking for a lone white male. In November 1990, after the longest murder trial in British history, 3 of them were found guilty and were sentenced to life imprisonment. The real murderer was Geoffrey Gaffour. In September 2000, an independent review into unsolved murders in South Wales paved the way for a fresh inquiry. 8 years later, South Wales police reopened the case and discovered fresh forensic evidence at the scene, including specks of blood on the cellophane wrapper of a cigarette packet and on a skirting board, which had since been painted over. This started the hunt for a new suspect who was dubbed the Cellophane Man. After scientists looked into one of the rare DNA components, they narrowed down a list of people who had that component, with one result particularly sticking out. That partial match was with a youth who was not born when the 1988 killing took place, but who had had dealings with the police. But testing of the 14-year-old's family found a close relative whose DNA matched that of Cellophane Man's, and he was instantly suspected as Lynette's murderer. That relative's name was Geoffrey Ghampour, who had worked as a security guard at his family's shop in nearby Roath at the time of Lynette's death. In 2003, Ghampour was arrested by police, but in a bid to avoid justice, the suspect attempted to commit suicide by taking an overdose of pills when he realized he was about to be apprehended. But as police had Ghampour under surveillance, they prevented him from doing so and took him to hospital. It was on his way to get medical attention that he confessed to killing Lynette. Ghampour was sentenced at Cardiff Crown Court to life in prison for the 1988 murder. The defendant had explained to the court that on the last night of Lynette's life, he had paid her for sex up front, but changed his mind when he saw the state of her flat in Butetown, which had no electricity or running water. He then demanded back his £30, which she refused, before attacking her in fury. Prosecutor Patrick Harrington, Queen's Counsel, described the moment Ghampour confessed to the court. He took a deep breath and said, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." He was ordered to serve a minimum of 13 years. Mr. Justice John Royce, who sentenced Ghampour, said, "For 15 years, you kept your guilty secret and evaded justice, even while others stood trial for the murder you knew that you had committed. The notorious murderer has not been deemed suitable for release, according to the parole board." The coronavirus pandemic prevented Ghampour from making as much progress as hoped, since he was transferred to an open prison in September 2020. While in prison, Ghampour has reportedly taken part in programs to address his decision-making, better ways of thinking, and tendency to use violence. In 2023, it was recommended that Ghampour could be allowed out on day release, but was not yet suitable to be allowed out on license following a parole board review. On January 24, 1980, 23-year-old nursing student Mary Robin Walter was found dead in her trailer in Great Bend, Kansas, a small town about 100 miles northwest of Wichita. The young mother had been shot multiple times. There had been a suspect, Stephen Lawrence Hanks, in the early days of the investigation, according to Barton County Sheriff Brian Bellendier, but there reportedly wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. Bellendier, who became an officer in Barton County in 1982, stated that the case had haunted the department for the last 4 decades. In April 2022, a detective decided to take a fresh look at the case and found that there was some overlooked information as well as some new details about the case. Re-interviewing witnesses as well as the discovery of brand new evidence in October allowed the officers to submit the case for prosecution. Hanks was a neighbor of the victim at the time. Today, Hanks is 69 years old. Witnesses called by the state included Deputy Guy Disney, who responded to the scene after Walter's husband, Douglas, found her dead in the back bedroom, and Roger Butler, who was the sergeant on patrol at the Great Bend Police Department and attended the autopsy conducted by Dr. Edward Jones. The following day, according to the report, Jones found 17 bullet wounds, and several of them were fatal wounds. He recovered 9 bullets from her body. The state produced evidence that the bullets came from a .22 semi-automatic Ruger pistol that had been purchased by Douglas Walter and was found in a dresser drawer in the bedroom. It was noted that to fire that many rounds, the pistol would have to be reloaded. The state's final witness was Detective Adam Hales with the Barton County Sheriff's Office. In April of 2022, while recovering from COVID-19, Hales took a fresh look at the evidence and reopened the decades-old investigation into the homicide of Mary Robin Walter. He testified that he and Lieutenant David Payton drove to Hank's home in Burton twice to interview him. Hales also transported Hanks to the Barton County Jail after the Kansas Bureau of Investigation arrested him in Oxford last October, and he interviewed him a fourth time at the Barton County Sheriff's Office. Burton is in Cowley County and Oxford is in Sumner County. Stephen Hanks was a suspect in the original investigation, Hales said, but I couldn't find any interview of Mr. Hanks since 1980. During the interview, Hales mentioned there was no forced entry into the Walter home and asked Hanks what that told him. She would have to have invited him in, Hales said, referring to his notes of Hanks' responses. I asked, "This was an accident, right?" Hales said, and Hanks nodded. Hanks reportedly told the officers that Walter was wearing a bathrobe, which was consistent with other evidence, and that he followed her into the bedroom, but she grabbed the gun from the dresser. In a later interview, Hales said, Hanks told him the victim started to have oral sex with him, but then bit him and grabbed the gun from the dresser. Hales said, Payton asked Hanks what happened when the first shot went off. He said, well, it scared the hell out of me, and he resorted to his army training. He didn't know what caused her to grab the gun. Asked if Walter was in pain, Hanks said he didn't remember. Asked what happened to the gun, he said he left it there. The gun was found in the dresser drawer. Hanks told them he went back to his trailer, upset and crying. At the second interview, Hanks told the officers he had been sober for 41 years, and alcohol was something he struggled with back in 1980. Hales asked, if you hadn't been drinking, this would not have happened. Is that fair? He replied, that's fair. They asked if he thought Pam Walter, the victim's daughter, who was 6 years old in 1980, deserved to have closure. She needs it, Hanks reportedly told Hales. What happened was not meant to happen. During the third interview, on the trip to jail, Hales asked Hanks if he'd ever thought about talking to law enforcement. He said he'd thought about it a few times, but I didn't want to lose my freedom, lose everything I'd worked for. He claimed Walter was the one who grabbed the gun first. She tried to use it on me. I was trying to leave, but my instincts took over. But why was he in the bedroom? He said the victim invited him back to the bedroom. In the fourth interview, conducted at the Barton County Sheriff's Office, after Hanks had been advised of his right to remain silent, Hanks talked to Hales about the cancer he is currently being treated for, and said he did not want to die in prison. I've been doing time for the last 42 years, looking over my shoulder, he reportedly told Hales. She was going to kill me. At this point in his testimony, Hales talked about the new DNA evidence and a sketch found a year later, when Hanks was investigated in the course of a later investigation. The origin of the sketch was not explained, but Hales said it was sexual in nature and showed a man with a gun to a woman's head. He said he asked Hanks, "Is that you replaying what happened?" The answer, "It might have been on my mind." Hales said Hanks' DNA was found in Mary Robin Walter's mouth. This discovery came from MVAC technology, which is very new. Investigators had to send a sample to a private lab in Florida for testing. This is not Hanks's only brush with the law. He was arrested in 1981 and charged with aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and rape, according to records from the Kansas Department of Corrections. He was paroled in 1991 and on probation until December 1993. Stephen L. Hanks faces a second-degree murder charge and is reportedly being held on a $500,000 bond. In response to the break in the case, Mary Robin Walter's niece, Leslie Schrag, issued a statement on behalf of the family, saying in part, "We are grateful for detectives' efforts to bring Robin's murderer to justice. Robin was truly beautiful inside and out," Schrag said. "This world was robbed of her presence, and we will never know how that has shaped our lives. Many of those who knew Robin are gone. Her parents, husband, and a sister will not get to share in our collective relief that Robin's case will have a conclusion." Investigators identified a 9-year-old girl's killer more than 50 years after she was abducted, less than a block from her Georgia home. 9-year-old Debbie Lynn Randall, 3rd grader, was walking home January 13, 1972, from a laundromat about a half-block away, when she was abducted, raped, and strangled to death. A near citywide search for Randall was initiated and included about 4,000 volunteers. A group of Southern Tech students found her remains 16 days later. Marietta police followed up on hundreds of leads without success. In October 2001, detectives sent a hair removed from Randall's body for DNA testing. The Cobb County Cold Case Unit received the case in 2015. In May of that year, a piece of clothing from Randall was sent for an updated test. Both pieces of evidence were then used to create a partial profile of a suspect. John and Duanita Randall died in recent years without ever knowing who kidnapped, raped, and strangled their daughter after she went across the street from their family's home north of Atlanta, Georgia, to run an errand in 1972. But authorities never stopped pursuing the truth about Debbie's slaying, and in September of this year, their community learned the identity of her killer. By all indications, it was a stranger who ultimately died by suicide, authorities announced, citing the results of an investigation that combined evidence collected shortly after Randall's death, as well as DNA technology. William Rose, who was related to people living in the same apartment complex as Randall's family, had not been a suspect in the case until the DNA technology linked him to Debbie's murder. Debbie's brother, Melvin Randall, stated, "It's a relief to my family that it was no one that we knew. And it's just great that it's over. Maybe we can rest about it and not worry about it, wondering who it was. It's weighed heavy on us for a long time." DNA testing carried out in 2019, made possible by extra funding, and a reanalysis of the cloth in 2022 brought investigators even closer to answers. Further DNA testing last year then brought investigators into touch with people who were probably related to the killer. Those relatives supplied DNA samples to assist authorities, and investigators said that evidence convinced them that Rose had murdered Debbie about 2 years before he died by his own hand at the age of 24. Exhuming Rose from his grave and running DNA testing on his body confirmed investigators' suspicions, Brody said. Ron Alter, a cold case investigator in Brody's office, told reporters that he did not believe Rose knew Debbie Lynn. Alter said what most likely happened was he saw her alone, perceived that to be a chance to abduct her, and acted on the opportunity. "I believe that was a crime of opportunity," Alter said. Alter also made sure to mention his suspicion that Rose, who had prior arrests for alcohol-related cases, killed himself out of fear that he would be imprisoned for Debbie Lynn's murder. Melvin recalled the guilt he carried for years because he was sick the day Rose kidnapped his sister, and he couldn't be at her side when she set out for the laundromat. He told the newspaper that he remembered knocking on neighbors' doors and posting flyers, desperately hoping either would help him and his family reunite with his sister, who loved playing baseball with him. The siblings' father died last year. Their mother died of leukemia in 2018. Despite the losses he has endured, and the painful circumstances around all of them, Melvin Randall said he was not angry with either Rose or his family. "I know they're struggling, going through this too," said Melvin Randall, now a grandfather. "It was tough for us, and I'm sure it's just as tough for them. I wish all of them well, and God bless them, and I don't have any animosity toward them." Thanks for watching. If you like my content, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel.